not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech. It prevented Parliament from carrying out its constitutional role for 5 out of the possible 8 weeks between the end of the summer recess and exit day on the 31st of October. Proroguing Parliament is quite different from Parliament going into recess. While Parliament is prorogued, neither House can meet, debate, or pass legislation. Neither House can debate government policy, nor may members ask written or oral questions of ministers or meet and take evidence in committees. In general, bills which have not yet completed all their stages are lost and will have to start again from scratch after the Queen's speech. During a recess, on the other hand, the House does not sit, but parliamentary business can otherwise continue as usual. This prolonged suspension of parliamentary democracy took place in quite exceptional circumstances. The fundamental change, which was due to take place in the Constitution of the United Kingdom on the 31st of October. Parliament, and in particular the House of Commons, as the elected representatives of the people, has a right to a voice in how that change comes about. The effect on the fundamentals of our democracy was extreme. No justification for taking action with such an extreme effect has been put before the court. The only evidence of why it was taken is the memorandum from Nicky da Costa of 15th August. This explains why holding the Queen's speech to open a new session of Parliament on the 14th of October would be desirable. It does not explain why it was necessary to bring parliamentary business to a halt for 5 weeks before that, when the normal period necessary to prepare for a Queen's speech is 4 to 6 days. It does not discuss the difference between prorogation and recess. It does not discuss the impact of prorogation on the special procedures for scrutinising the delegated legislation necessary to achieve an orderly withdrawal from the European Union, with or without a withdrawal agreement, on the 31st of October. It does not discuss what parliamentary time would be needed to secure parliamentary approval for any new withdrawal agreement as required by Section 13 of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The Court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. The next and final question, therefore, is what the legal effect of that finding is, and therefore what remedies the Court should grant. The Court can certainly declare that the advice was unlawful. The Inner House went further and declared that any prorogation resulting from it was null and of no effect. The government argues that the Inner House could not do that because the prorogation was a, quote, proceeding in Parliament, end quote, which, under the Bill of Rights of 1688, cannot be impugned or questioned in any court. But it is quite clear that the prorogation is not a proceeding in Parliament.
Bojo, once again, for all of his best laid plans, is slapped down. The prorogation is ruled unlawful. The suspension of Parliament that Bojo implemented is ruled unlawful. She goes further. Not just is it unlawful, because it's unlawful, Parliament can be back into effect. Meaning tomorrow, Wednesday, Parliament will be back on the job scrutinizing the government, seeing as the courts, the UK courts, or you could say the Scottish courts, co-signed right now by the UK courts. All of them agreed that this prorogation was unlawful. Understand why. The argument is the people themselves, meaning the public, is represented by Parliament. And if you're getting rid of Parliament in order to push through your own particular negotiations, you are literally undermining the will of the public itself and stopping Parliament from doing what it is constitutionally supposed by law to do. And you haven't came up with a good justification for why you are doing such. The reality of it is, and the court kind of makes the point, that anybody that has brains and eyes come away with the conclusion that the reason that Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament was because he didn't want Parliament scrutinizing his actions. That he understands that Parliament has no capacity at all for a no-deal Brexit, the very thing, meaning the no-deal Brexit, that he is using as the club in negotiations with the European Union. Take a listen to Boris Johnson's response to this, because Burkow came out and essentially said Parliament will be back in session tomorrow on Wednesday, and we will be back scrutinizing the government doing what we are constitutionally supposed to do. Let's talk about it. Let's flip first and let's talk about it. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, find yourself coming back often, like, share, subscribe. Of course, you can support through PayPal or Patreon. This will be a quick video because I have to get to the radio show, but I wanted to point this out because this was the big news of the day. Bojo slapped down once again. The proroguing of Parliament tossed aside by the judicial branch. Interestingly to note, part of their reasoning is, look, there is no political remedy for this because for the most part he's destroyed Parliament. Meaning Parliament is supposed to be the thing that represents the public. Parliament is supposed to be the thing that represents the people's will. And you've gotten rid of that. So this notion of proroguing being something in Parliament itself, Parliament didn't get a choice on this. Parliament didn't agree on this. This was something between you and the Queen. And as such, this becomes somewhat of a matter for the courts. Their point is this. This isn't something that Parliament could deal with because this is really something between you and the Queen. And what you told the Queen wasn't entirely true, making this not necessarily lawful. Your reasoning for proroguing Parliament had everything to do with you not wanting Parliament to scrutinize your actions. And there was no good justification for doing so, considering that Britain is about to leave the European Union on the 31st. And if Parliament is to be anything and is to live up to their constitutional responsibility, they need to be in session. And I agree with the judge on this. I know I'm somewhat of an odd duck on this notion of Brexit and British politics. I don't think I'm that odd at all. The public decided it wanted to leave. That's where I'm at. I'm just in line with what the public said they wanted. And while I am on the side of the public saying they wanted to leave, I am also on this notion of the public should get a say-so from the standpoint of parliamentary will in scrutinizing the government, especially if the public is not on board for a no-deal Brexit. Boris Johnson wasn't elected. He was only elected by a bunch of Tories. I think it was like maybe 90,000 people in a country of 66 million. So this notion that this one man can take them out all on his own is somewhat doesn't necessarily fly to me. The public decided it wanted to leave. Great. I support Corbyn, who can't even institute the policies that he wants under an EU, despite the fact that Corbyn's, and that's a whole nother matter, doesn't really make any sense in the sense of his position on Brexit. Again, that's a whole separate matter. That conference that Labour went through yesterday made zero sense in regards to their policies. Whatever you want to think of Bojo, he's very clear on what he wants. I want to leave the European Union, even if that means leaving on the 31st without a deal. Just to bring it back without going into a tangent. What the court knows, and what the court is not really making any questions or decisions on, is the merits of Brexit, how Brexit is implemented, and all that. Those things are political choices. The court's choice was pretty straightforward. Was the proroguing legal or not? They said it was unlawful, meaning, for all intents and purposes, didn't exist. She even made the argument that it would have been like they took a blank sheet of paper into Parliament asking for the proroguing of Parliament, or took a blank sheet of paper into the House of Lords or to the Queen asking for proroguing of Parliament. It didn't exist. That's a legal choice. That's not a political one. The political one is how do you implement Brexit. The legal one is whether or not it was lawful. I hope you understand the difference. What is going to take place now is tomorrow, Parliament will be back in sessions. Whether Boris Johnson tries to prorogue again or not, separate question. Can he legally do it? Yes, he can legally prorogue Parliament once again. Whether the Queen would accept it a second time, who knows? I got to be honest, British politics at this point has gotten so chaotic that it's kind of not necessarily entirely clear on what takes place from this point on. Boris Johnson's response to this was as follows.
Yes, obviously this is a verdict that we will respect, and we respect the judicial process. I have to say I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back. I do think there's a
Now,
good case
Boris
for
Johnson
getting
doesn't
all-
think it's right because, for the most part, his argument is this is a political decision. This is not a legal decision. And if you're in the United States, this looks a little weird to us. In the U.S., the courts often makes choices on laws and so forth. The courts is almost the determining factor on the legality of laws. I mean, it literally is a determining factor on legality of laws. But it implements itself in political decisions all the time in the United States. Not so much in the UK. I mean, and so this was considered somewhat of a big deal that the courts would make this choice. But the court's argument is Parliament has no ability to politicize this because Parliament is not in session. You've destroyed the ability of Parliament to have a say-so, which makes this a decision for the courts. It makes it a legal decision. That's the way they were framing it, as opposed to the way Johnson was framing it. I think this decision is right. Even if I'm in favor of Brexit because the public decided it wanted to leave. What Boris Johnson did was entirely in order to stop the scrutiny of the Parliament over his actions. It is true that the public doesn't really want a no-deal Brexit. It is true there's no capacity within Parliament. It is also true that that is the club that Boris Johnson is using to try to get concessions out of the European Union. Well, the courts have just taken that away, meaning Boris Johnson has a Parliament where he has no majority. He has a Parliament that is going to be hostile to the Prime Minister because of the proroguing of Parliament. There are going to be several calls for Boris Johnson to resign and to step down. Now, this is slightly laughable because if Labour wanted to have the election, they could have called the snap election, in which case they could have taken Boris Johnson out of office. They decided not to do that, even though they're now calling for him to step down. Pay attention to tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be very interesting in regards to what happens in Parliament. Either way, Bojo loses the stick that he was going to use to hit the European Union, making any deal with the European Union that much more unlikely. By the same token, the court, I think, is right in saying that Bojo was doing this entirely for political reasons and that the reason he gave the Queen was not necessarily accurate or not necessarily earnest. And it is also true that Labour's position on Brexit makes no sense. All of those things are true at once, making this weird, to say the least. Pay attention to British politics. I'm sorry if this was a little hasty, but this ruling just came out and I'm somewhat of in a rush. But everything I said in this video, I think, is in line and is right. And I'll put articles below so you can see it and read it for yourself. It's interesting to say the least. And if anybody can tell you what is going to take place tomorrow, I would be fascinated to do so. And by tomorrow, I don't just mean tomorrow, meaning a specific day. Because understand, right now, Boris Johnson, under law, is supposed to go to the European Union and get them to sign, to sign on the line requesting an extension. Boris Johnson has said he would never under any terms do this. And he's been very cagey about this, saying, yes, we will follow the law. No, I'm not going to go to the European Union to do this. These two positions are incompatible with one another, and yet Boris Johnson is holding these two positions when he's in interviews. And now, he has this verdict against him, which means Parliament will be back in session, scrutinizing and criticizing the government, a government that has no capacity to enact legislation because he has no majority. The European Union's British political instrument, the longest-running parliament, longest-running democracy, is broken. I'll see you guys in a few. Thanks all. Like, share, subscribe.